You just need to have the proper vehicle to do your type of sport. If you do Formula One, you need a Formula One. You need a big team of 200 people just adjusting every single millimeter of equipment. And you need to have the proper just laps, number of laps, and then change each piece at each right moment. When you do Gran Turismo, you've got other problems. You need to have a co-pilot. You need to have all-round equipment. So, why am I saying that? It's because people are conflating all the types of entrepreneurship together, and I think it's not right, because when you launch a business, you need to be clear on what you want to achieve, what are you in there for.
Good evening. It's great to be here and to be here again. A year after having been here, sharing our findings from the year before, and you know, it's 5 years into this project of producing this report, and it's kind of been interesting to see how the story of European tech has evolved during that period. It's so much more richer, so much more nuanced than when we started, and to reflect that, we've really had to scale the report. So I can only really give you a super brief summary of what we've put together, and it's a much larger body of work, and so I would encourage you to go and visit the report site, stateofeuropeantech.com, and play with the data and draw your own conclusions from the insights that we put together for you there. When we kicked things off, belief in European tech was largely limited to the European tech industry itself. Already back then in 2015, I think people who were on the inside could see that there'd been a bunch of real breakthrough achievements, and those could become the platform for even greater success. And belief is something that's so important to developing a healthy tech ecosystem. It's as important as capital. It's as important as the talent within those ecosystems. Belief is ultimately the thing that drives ambition, for one thing, and it's the thing that helps people that have a great idea today become the founder of tomorrow. Belief is the thing that takes someone down that journey of giving up the security of a well-paid corporate job to ultimately the unpredictability of startup life. Belief is the thing that moves markets. It shapes capital allocation and investment. And so you kind of fast forward 5 years to today, and I think what's been interesting, and the conclusion that we took from this report, was that belief that we had that was kind of homegrown within the European tech industry is now translated to the rest of the outside world. The data is really clear, and I think the message has finally landed that something special is happening here. And of course, there's things that we need to continue working on. But you just have to take a look at some of the headline numbers. And you really start to get a sense for why people have started to believe. When we started the report in 2015, there was about $10 billion of investment into European tech. That, at the time, felt like a gigantic milestone. Last year, you had $35 billion. Back then, we pointed to a lack of late-stage funding as being a real challenge for the European ecosystem. Last year, more than 50 European tech companies raised rounds of $100 million or more. Back then, there were something like a couple of dozen venture-backed technology companies that scaled to $1 billion valuation or higher. I think we say 99 on the slide here, but that number, since we published the report in November, has already kind of scaled beyond that, and there are more than 100. So, we have some really fantastic numbers, but, what does all this really mean? Well, I think one thing for a start is that, top-tier US VCs have woken up to what is happening here too, and maybe this is something that we can discuss when we get into the panel. The amount of time they're spending on the ground in Europe is clearly on the rise. So is their investment activity. More than 19% of all rounds in Europe last year involved the participation of at least one investor from the US. That's more than doubled since when we first did the report. It's also helping to unlock mainstream institutional capital, which has really been on the outside of the European tech industry for far too long. One of the things that we've seen, particularly in the last year, is a change in mindset from one really important source of capital, and that's pension funds. Pension funds committed more than $1 billion to European venture funds in 2019, and in doing so helped to push VC fundraising to new records again. And we really believe that by rebalancing their allocations away from legacy industries and redirecting their focus towards game-changing technology, they can help to bring the future forward here in Europe. And so it's great that commitments from pension funds to European VCs that is ultimately being deployed into European tech startups is up nearly threefold. But I think what's really exciting is that now that they've got this belief and conviction in the opportunity here, there's so much room for growth to continue to power the growth of the ecosystem here going forward. The sort of staggering fact is that European pension funds sit on assets of more than $4 trillion, so that kind of puts that billion-dollar number into some perspective. So, all of this is great, but we really believe that this is not a moment for complacency for the European tech ecosystem. We can't afford to kind of lose focus in continuing to build. We think that this is a time where we have to continue to chart our own course and to continue to look to ways to build an ecosystem here across Europe that focuses on the unique strengths and values that we have, and not spend too much time fixating on what's happening in the US or China. And so what I'd like to do is kind of pick out 3 areas where we think European tech can really sort of differentiate itself and continue to shape its own destiny on the global technology stage. So, the first kind of area that really came through to us strongly was this opportunity for policymakers to play a big role in the future of European tech. What was interesting to us from our survey was that we see that there's still, a massive disconnect between policymakers on the one hand and the industry on the other. Whilst European tech founders and investors alike have never been more optimistic about the future of what's happening in European tech, policymakers that responded to our survey were by far the most skeptical. And it's kind of as if, the two worlds are still sort of talking past each other. Now, we'll come on to the French angle specifically when we get to the panel, because I think things are slightly different here. But let's unpack that later. But, I think what's kind of been interesting to us is that despite the fact that European tech has exploded over the last 5 years, when you look at those setting the policy agenda, particularly in Brussels, there's been more of a focus on, US tech giants than there has been on championing the existing tech innovation that is already flourishing so successfully here. So, I think it's kind of interesting, when you ask the industry, what are the things that matter to you, what is it that you want from policymakers, what we hear very clearly is it's, help and support in the things that really make a difference on the day-to-day, overcome those barriers to scaling, help me to grow even bigger and faster. And we hear repeatedly, it's things like helping me to hire and incentivize attracting the best talent, or just helping me to make it simpler and easier to operate across what is still a really fragmented European market. And it's kind of interesting that in Brussels there's still more focus on taxation of tech giants than there is on changes to stock option taxation. So I think there's this real risk that we're kind of taking our eyes off the real prize here. And I think the opportunity is to continue to build this ecosystem organically from the bottom up and continue to support European tech innovation. And in order to do that, I think what we need is a two-way conversation. 2020, it's a new decade, it's a new term for the European Commission. This is a window of opportunity for closer engagement. But if the tech industry across Europe asks Brussels to open the door, we have to be ready to go and walk through. And I think there is this great opportunity and moment now to sort of inform and shape the future together and to work more collaboratively to try to create those optimal conditions that will enable further European tech success. So, last year, we highlighted in our report that the whole European tech industry needs a wake-up call when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Now, sadly, in this year's report, we demonstrate that there's been no real progress at all. In 2019, just 8% of all funding into the European tech industry went to founding teams that are women or are of mixed gender. And so, last year's numbers that we shared were shocking. This year's numbers were no different. That being said, we did see some early signs that things may start to change. So our survey found, for example, that awareness on this issue is increasing. We are seeing that people feel better informed, they feel more empowered to take positive action, to do things like hire more diverse talent into their companies, or simply just to make diversity a priority. We're also seeing that VCs are starting to make changes to the way that they source new investment opportunities. But at the same time too, we also found that the onus to kind of lead this charge is falling upon women and founders from underrepresented backgrounds to do that themselves. So it was interesting that our survey showed very clearly that women VCs are disproportionately more likely to be the ones that attend events where there's greater diversity amongst founders. They're the ones that are more likely to be focusing on sectors where there's greater founder diversity. They're more likely to be running open office hours. And so these are all approaches which can be effective to help to drive change in some of those numbers, but it requires the whole industry to take part in that, not just some, but all. And so, we're really having to say and repeat the message that we gave last year, which is, diversity, equality, and inclusion in the tech industry needs to be a priority for all of us. And, we won't realize the full potential within Europe around technology if we continue to let talent and value evaporate because of inertia on this issue around diversity. So, last year, Margaret Vestager, who is one of the European commissioners, has really been sort of given the task of setting out the vision for a digital Europe. She made an interesting statement to say that, China has all the data, the US has all the money, but here in Europe we have purpose. And I think there's some truth in that. And what we found in our report was that there's a growing number of European founders who aren't just aiming for commercial success, but are really trying to solve some of the world's largest problems at the same time. And if we think that that's something that makes business sense, when you look at consumers, when you look at employees and talent, they're demanding that companies think about more than just the bottom line. And what we found was that there's a growing number of European tech companies that are kind of embedding purpose as a core part of their mission. As part of our research, we identified more than 500 European tech companies that are taking on one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals head on. So, you can think of a company like Infarm, which is from Berlin, who are basically taking an environmentally impactful approach to farming. They use 95% less water, 75% fewer pesticides than industrial farming methods. Or Insect is a good example from here in Paris, or someone like Dr. Lieb addressing challenges around healthcare access. And there are many, many others, and what we've seen is that investors are directing their attention to these types of companies. We found that more than $4.4 billion have been invested into purpose-driven European tech companies in the last year. That's a number that's grown more than 6x over a 5-year period. So it's really incredibly exciting to observe this trend whereby there's a very clear shift in capital allocation from investors who are adopting this kind of more conscious investment approach. And I think, ultimately it makes sense from an investor perspective. The world's largest problems are some of the world's largest market opportunities. And I think we're at a point now where it's becoming clear that, profit and purpose are not two things that are mutually exclusive, but rather mutually reinforcing. So, let me just kind of wrap up before we go into the panel. I think what the last 5 years of kind of doing this report and the last 5 years of the development of the European tech ecosystem have proven is that, you know, not only can we here in Europe do tech, we can actually do it in our own European way. So we've learned many of the lessons from what has helped to make Silicon Valley the preeminent place globally to build a tech company, but we've not necessarily blindly copied their approach. I think, you know, we are here in Europe strengthened by the differences that we have. We're not limited by them. You know, we are richer for the unique blend of cultures and values that we have. And I think by doing things our way, we've been able to transform belief that Europe can play a role on the global technology stage. And so, you know, I think it's kind of an interesting moment where it's now in our hands to go and create our own vision for the future of technology in Europe. And, you know, our kind of message is that, you know, let's make this an ecosystem that continues to create enormous value, but does so by embedding diversity and purpose, you know, into that at the same time. So that was all I wanted to say. So thank you. And I think what I'd like to do now is invite up Alice, Bruno, and Carol, who are somewhere here, to come and join me on stage. Thank you. Flip this to another slide. Yeah, cheers. Hi everyone, good evening. So, I guess we should start off with a quick round of intro. So do you just want to very quickly say who you are and what you do, and then we can get straight into it after that. So maybe I'll start over there with you, Carol.
So hi everyone, I'm Carol. I'm the CEO and founder of Joone Paris. We make baby care, baby cosmetics for women, and we recently launched a line of supplements for women. So we're a direct-to-consumer brand, and we've been live for 2.5 years, I think. And yeah, we're...
Hi everyone, I'm Bruno. I'm the co-founder and partner at Frst, which is a seed fund dedicated to French entrepreneurs building global scale companies. And I kind of relate a lot with what Tom has been saying in his keynote before the panel.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alice. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the family. So Vladimir already introduced you. The family, basically, we accompany startups in Europe. I will try to give you tonight a glimpse of what I've seen this year regarding the startup landscape.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, let's get straight into it. So, it's been, 2019 was another big year for Europe. It was also, a big year for France, and I think it was another record year in terms of level of investment. We're approaching something like $5 billion into the French ecosystem. I can see that 2020 has already started off where 2019 left off. Another huge round announced today with Conto. Alice, since you offered to share some views on what's changed in the last 12 months, maybe we can kick off with you. What do you think have been some of the things that have been, important changes in the last 12 months, specifically here in France?
So it's not my favorite game to play the expert and to take one step back, but for you, I've tried to take some notes and to see what happened this year. So basically there are 4 main points. The first one is the level of ambition. So very concretely, you can see the amount that have been raised this year. If I just take from the portfolio of the family, Algolia, Payfit and Conto, Payfit raised 110, Algolia 104, Conto 70 million euros. These levels are Silicon Valley levels, but without the cost of Silicon Valley, meaning an engineer in France is not as expensive, right? So it's a sign that the ambition is really getting higher. The second point is that we have very good news regarding employees' equity. So France is really getting better on that part, and actually France might become the country where equity for employees is the most attractive, the most interesting, with discounts, even discounts that could be more interesting than the ones for investors. And it's not only for French employees, it can also be applied to foreigners employed in France with foreign companies. So this is really something good. The third point is, you've heard of the 6 billion announced by the government to be invested in the startups. So that's a good sign as well. And the fourth point is, on a more day-to-day basis, from my view, you know, we have a lot of people applying to the family, and we can read this application forms with my team, and really the level of education, of mindset of the people, the young people applying, is totally changed since when I started 8 years ago. I think it's due to the education that is accessible online, and people are actually looking and watching this content. So all of these points are kind of making it more optimistic, I guess.
Thank you. Very, very clear. So Bruno, maybe I'll come to you, and we can perhaps pick up on that point around ambition. I mean, I guess you spend your days meeting young, you know, maybe not young entrepreneurs. And you've been doing that for quite some time, so do you sense something different in the ambition levels that you're seeing from those entrepreneurs that you meet?
Yep. Well, I would say that arguably 2019, in a way, nothing has changed. And at the same time, everything has changed in the way that it has become clear to everyone that what was brewing below the surface, which was this culture of ambition, this generation of founders that are angling towards building global scale companies, all the ecosystem around that has been federated around this level of ambition, which Alice has described, and which has been brewing for 5-6 years, and arguably we can say that the family has been instrumental to that, to you know, broadcasting this culture of just being more ambitious than just what has been the common idea around the place. So in many ways it does not change, because it's just a continuation of that. It's just that it has become clear to everyone through all the fundraising, which are just basically milestones. It's when you fundraise, it's not an end game. It's just a milestone enabling you to do better stuff. And the next stage of your company. What is cool is that we're seeing as an early proof point the fact that the investors funding those rounds are international investors, which has been very different from the past, where maybe you could say that there were French investors backing French companies to build French and local players, and now we are seeing time and time again companies that are considered by international investors to be global, to be world class, because international investors can invest in France, but they can choose not to if they don't want to. They can invest in the UK, in Germany, in the US, and I think that this is a great proof point that the French ecosystem has matured and is now world class. And going back to your question around ambition, I think it's the way we think about the ecosystem is when we decided to launch, we were looking at the ecosystem 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and we've been always thinking in terms of contributing to a circle that is self-reinforcing, and nurturing this mindset of ambition takes time, and you need to have role models that allow new entrepreneurs to build on the shoulders of giants, and that push the ambition even further. And so I think that's what we're seeing at play today.
I love what you guys said, and I love to be as optimistic as you guys. I do agree with you. There's a lot of ambition and a lot more talent and a lot more desire to be stronger. I would tone it down a little bit because the UK is still way too big compared to the actual size of its population and the actual potential for especially e-commerce. Even though they do work with the same language than the US. I would say that I start seeing in France stuff that I used to see when I was in San Francisco 6-8 years ago. People would just show up and start raising funds and raising 1 million on a weird valuation. And now, when I started my first company 5-6 years ago, we used to raise like 200, 300K, and now I don't even see the startups anymore. I feel like everyone's coming in and raising 1 million always as a first go-to-get point. And my point is, the valuation game in Europe is... in Europe, not particularly in France, is interesting, but also is a little bit complicated because we're not lacking VCs, and we're not lacking startups, and we're not lacking talent. We're lacking exit potentials. Like we're really not that strong on corporation that can really shell out lots of cash to buy these startup companies at the valuation where they stand. It's something that globally, I mean, we've all seen the failed IPO for WeWork and stuff like that. But globally speaking, we were talking about this a few days ago. It's hard, I think. It's easy to raise money. It's easy to raise funds and to get a really high valuation. It's a lot more complicated to exit at said valuation within Europe, especially because the European potential acquirers always want to think about something globally. And if you haven't proved that you can be global, then it's just, like an assumption that you can go global, which is a shame because when they do like really expensive acquisitions in the US, Dollar Shave Club that was overpaid $1 billion has never gone anywhere outside of the US, and the US market, somehow is limited in its scope. So I think it's a bit unfair that we're not yet at a level where corporations in Europe feel confident enough to really shell out lots of cash to do like proper acquisitions. So that would be my area of concern for the future. But yeah, lots of talent, lots of ambition. We just need like more exit material, I guess.
Maybe let's pick up that point because it's the data in the report is kind of aligned to what you're saying in that last year was a really quiet year from an exit perspective for European tech. It came off the back of a kind of blockbuster year in 2018, but you didn't really see big, gigantic IPOs in the same way that you did in the US. Now, of course, not all of those were successful. I guess like the counter argument is that for a long time we've been saying to entrepreneurs, hey, we want you to be ambitious, and part of what that means is building and scaling companies and kind of growing to like, multi-billion-dollar valuations. And I suppose there's a growing cohort of French companies, whether it's, Doctolib and Miro and Algolia and, Payfit, and, many of them are in the family's portfolio that are, I think that are sort of deliberately staying private in some sense because they have access to capital. They can raise rounds of hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you think that maybe that ambition to build large businesses is one of the reasons that we're not necessarily seeing that vibrant exit landscape at the moment?
I wish I could say yes, but I don't think that's the case. If you have to look at it at a standpoint. At the end of the day, there's always an end line. So either you IPO or you exit. And the issue is most of these companies, some do have IPO material, but a lot have definitely like road to exit. So I don't think that, I think the valuation game is interesting also because it really raises the stakes of how much money you can raise, and the money right now in the market is really cheap and it's really easy to raise a lot of capital. But at the same time, it probably scares off, and it probably scares off a few acquirers to realize, that's the amount of money that we're speaking. And I think for a long time, acquirers and even the people who bought, Dollar Shave Club and these guys probably bought these people at this valuation at a time when they were not educated, and when the startups and the people, actually the talents, get educated, well, unfortunately, the acquirers also get educated, and they also realize that it probably has much more value buying at an earlier stage where people don't want to buy because they want to play the valuation game, and just, you know, keep pushing the envelope until a time when it gets too expensive for them. So I think, unfortunately, big corporations get to learn as well from their mistakes, and they've exited this phase of naiveness where they were, you know, like over purchasing everything. And it's actually, I don't know if you know this guy, Frédéric Fernandez. He's a really smart guy, and because he does a lot of work with the brand, and he really says, like, the area in which we are entering is an area where acquirers have stopped being naive, and, you know, we cannot just oversell them anything just because we want to. But again, I don't want to crush the party and say, you know, there's hope. It's just, I think it's going to be a little bit more hard, because people get, you know, clever as they go. Unfortunately.
Well, I think that exits is, of course, a natural step in the life of mature ecosystem. So you need liquidity to get entrepreneurs, employees, investors, everyone successful that goes back to invest, launch new businesses, and maybe just even better, more ambitious businesses that are built on top of what they've learned. So yeah, of course, a liquidity landscape is necessary. I would tend to say that it's part of the job of the entrepreneurs and the investors to build companies that at each step passes a valuation mark that does not prevent it from exiting. So at each point, it, like any investor that is just professional, that is leading around a Series B, C, D, E in a company, they do not invest like with a blindfold and saying, okay, maybe we'll see what happens. I'm just shoving 100 million in that company and we'll see where it goes. I think they have a very clear view of what they can fund, what a company can build, and who they can exit to, or what's the next step. I would say that maybe the SoftBank Vision Fund arguably had a very specific approach on that, and I think it does not represent what's been the job of educated professional investors in the VC market in the US or in Europe. It's true that you sometimes overfund a company and you pay too much for a company that doesn't have the metrics. Everyone does that. There's some part of belief that sometimes entrepreneurs can grow into, and sometimes it's just a massive failure and the company closes down and no one buys it. But I think that's the life of venture. Returns are made out of one outlier out of 10, 15, 20, 30 from an investor perspective. And also the corporate exit. So I would say it's the bigger problem is to build companies that just change things, that actually generate revenue because you create value. Once you do that at scale, once you reach 100, 200, 300 million of good old-fashioned revenue paid by actual customers, I think it's worth something, and I think that many corporates would be happy to buy that, provided they have the expertise to do M&A, but I think that big corporations everywhere in the world have expertise in doing M&A. Maybe not in France, maybe not every single corporation in Europe, but the good thing when you build a global scale company, even though if you've built it in France, you can just sell it to a US company, you can IPO on the NASDAQ, you can just, once you achieve things and you generate revenue, you can do whatever you want, I think.
I think very lively conversation. I think what I take from what you're saying too is that there's a real opportunity, and I think really an important place where the European ecosystem needs to develop, which is to bring the corporate world along too. And you know, one of the things that we've looked at before is, well, where does cash sit in the world on balance sheets? And there's obviously a lot of cash on the balance sheets of large US tech companies. and that cash has historically been used to drive liquidity and M&A within Silicon Valley. But actually, when you sort of step back, European traditional incumbents hold more cash combined than any other region in the world. It's just not necessarily yet been directed towards tech. And so that's kind of an interesting opportunity. But I think, you know, it's sort of another one of those areas where we need to see closer collaboration and engagement. You know, and I talked about collaboration between policymakers in the tech industry, but corporates in the tech industry can be something that, yeah, drives liquidity into the market. Maybe I'm just going to pick up again on something that you kind of touched upon, which was the role that international and specifically US investors are playing in kind of coming into the market. Because, you know, one of the things that I mentioned was, you know, we're seeing that 1 in 5 rounds now across Europe as a whole is getting done by a US investor. It's changing the nature of competition. You know, valuations are getting pushed up and fundraising timelines happen faster, and there's changes to the terms, you know, in term sheets. So, like, Bruno, what are you seeing? Like, what has been the impact from a competitive perspective, and what does it mean for founders, given this sort of strengthened level of interest and competition on the investor side?
Well, as a seed investor, I'm quite protected from competition from US VCs, and I essentially see that as well, a logical step in what I was describing earlier on, that, well, we are building more and more world-class companies, so it's logical that more international investors look at those companies and want to invest. So it's a natural step, and I'm pretty happy with that. What US investors in particular, I think, bring to the table is, first, globally speaking, a mindset of an even more uncapped ambition. It's just totally different from what we always, you know, it's easy to compare yourself to the next person and say, okay, we're more ambitious than them, or more ambitious than the companies that has just 12 months, that is 12 months ahead of us. But having someone come up and just, you know, blow your mind about a new way of seeing your market and pushing you further, I think it's something that US investors are very good at, because they've been doing that for decades, and it's bringing fresh air into the ecosystem. And second, which is more pragmatic, they are bringing more expertise into how to bring your company to the US. They are bringing network, expertise in scaling, money, smart money, and I think it's an insurance for founders to be able to actually succeed in the US. It's very difficult for European entrepreneurs to raise money with European investors and then go to the US and say, okay, where is New York then again? And can I find the headquarters for Cisco? And just you ring the bell, it doesn't work. So you need to have network to open the doors there.
Okay, it makes sense. So Alice, you alluded in your kind of first answer to the fact that France, I think, now has been ranked number 2 as the second most attractive country in Europe for for stock option policies, and we've seen a bunch of announcements around changes to tech visas, and I guess Macron with his administration has kind of been on this like super aggressive campaign to really support and grow the tech ecosystem here. Like, what can you talk us through? So we see the headlines. What's the reality like on the ground, and what's the effect been, and are you optimistic about where things are going on that front?
First, being optimistic is more a personal decision. I think we have to make with ourselves. Come more often to the family. You can nurture your optimism, and I'm more focused on what we can change on the ground. Regarding Macron's, he's been really aggressive, as you said, on his policies on startups. The effect is that, yes, it's getting easier to start a company, but to scale a company, it's still hard. Maybe we could zoom in the situation of Europe and really see the fragmentation of our environment and really understand it. It's not that to repeat again something that you say, that you already know. You know, Europe is a fragmented market with 12 different languages, even if we try hard to speak English. As you can hear, it's not a mother tongue, it's not my real language, and it creates barrier. And it's not only the 12 language, it's also the regulations, because Macron has been very aggressive as well, in a good sense of it, with the single market. He was presenting the single market here with Osborne 2 or 3 years ago, and we were wishing that it would work. It works for certain industries, it works for financial services, it works for consumer goods, but not for all of the startups that are out of these industries. So still regulation makes it hard, and on a very simple basis, I mean, on a cultural basis. If you want to move your families from Paris to Berlin, finding a flat and getting rid of all of the administrative burden it's not that easy. So all of these constraints make it harder, and this market that we are thinking of, this European market, is it really true? Does it really exist? Can we grab it because of all of those barriers? And the last thing that we never talk about is the consumer, on the consumer perspective. To be honest, even if we are mind-blown by the Instagram, Facebook, Google, Hollywood movies, you know, some product can be one size fits all, right? So they don't have to adapt to each culture. But most of the product actually, they are integrated in our day-to-day lives, and we need it to be perfectly accurate with our own specificities. You know, it's like cuisine, it's like kitchen with the food. You can test Spanish food, you will enjoy it, but on a day-to-day basis, you want the food to smell and to taste exactly like how your mama cooks, you know? So it has to be adapted to your own culture, and still this is, it's hard. So what it means that it's, as you know, 10 times harder for European entrepreneurs to build scale-up startups. And I haven't even talked about the VCs, the European VCs. I mean, most of them have government LPs, so it creates constraints to invest in local, most of their funds in local companies, right? So it's not there yet.
And Karen, what's been your experience? Have you as someone who's a founder and scaling a business, have you found that things have got easier? What's been the effect for you?
Well, it's definitely easier to raise capital than it used to before. I would sit halfway between you guys in terms of scaling. The United States is still a nation with 50 different states, and when you launch in San Francisco, it means you launch in San Francisco. So you have California. How do you go to fucking Ohio? It's honestly like, how do you get to Ohio when you have a startup in San Francisco? It's really hard. So in terms of operations, you do have the same language. So of course it's easier going. Probably, I don't know if it's easier, but you do have the same language. So going from SF to Ohio is one thing, but there are so many different things in the US that make it hard to go from one state to another. And when you talk to companies in the US, they would say San Francisco, New York, that's easy. Unfortunately, there are 48 other states that we have to go to. And so that's also a challenge. Like, how do you tackle acquisitions? Because, everyone in Ohio wants to do acquisitions. So how do you tackle acquisition for Ohio? So it does take a lot of thinking, a lot of working. Otherwise, it would be too easy. So I would say that like American funds are really good at understanding that problem because they know that the 50 states are very different. And so I would say that American funds are really, really good at bringing companies to a more global level, whether it is European or you know, like American level. But honestly, we have really, really, really good funds in France. And what I've seen from the French funds is that they're really hands-on and really strategically involved. And I think that's a really core added value that we have compared to other funds in other countries. I think the French VCs have a tendency to be really strategically inclined. They have very rich backgrounds. They don't always come from a financial background. Well, most of them do, but they do have something extra that makes them very specific and has a lot of added value. So I think honestly, the French funding and ecosystem is really positive. And agreed, when the Americans come in and play the valuation game, then it's another story because they do have lots of valuation. But the ball is also in the hands of the entrepreneurs. Like, no one sets us on a valuation that we don't agree to. Like, it's your choice to choose not the highest valuation, but the best valuation. And I encourage everyone to watch this show that's called Silicon Valley from HBO. The first episode of season 2 explains to you why the highest valuation is not the best valuation. The best valuation is the valuation that you can match ultimately, and that makes you work for you and not for a fund. And that is something that is key in understanding. And I think that's something in the US that they've been really good at. And ultimately, we talk a lot about all the companies that do like wonderful exits in the US. We don't talk as much about the entire cemetery of dead startups in the US that have raised massive amount of capital and ultimately died. And I think that's something that people should talk about. I don't think we see as many of these highly funded catastrophes in Europe and especially in France. Because we all know 1 or 2, but we don't know like 20. And in the US, we know 20, like definitely.
It's interesting, yeah. I mean, there's definitely a real tendency in this industry for survivorship bias and just focus on the ones that make it. I think one of the other kind of interesting comments that I saw someone make recently was that although there are challenges in kind of scaling across Europe, actually maybe that's like added defensibility to some of the businesses. And actually, when you look at kind of some of the really interesting French companies that have been built recently, whether it's like Alan or Conto or others who've succeeded in growing really, really large in France and have tackled the complexities of building a business here. And I think if you're an outsider trying to come in and do the same thing, it's really hard to kind of adapt to like the local cultures and values and regulations and everything you say. So I think it's kind of interesting that we're at this point too, where the market opportunities are becoming large enough where scaled businesses can be built even if you're just going country by country across Europe. So, is that do you kind of see that? Like, is that something that you see, Bruno? That you can get excited about something that it doesn't necessarily have to be a case to build a global winner. It can be like, France plus, or how do you think about that?
Well, that's a great point. I think it's, and we're seeing many companies today that are built, in particular in the software for SMB space, where you're building companies with a European go-to-market, because the European market is big enough, and maybe on the B2B side it's slightly easier to bridge the gap around cultures that Alice was mentioning. B2C is very hard. B2B is maybe easier. And the SMB market in Europe, when you aggregate everything, it's very big. So you're seeing the opportunity to build multi-billion-dollar companies with only a European footprint. And we invested in some of them. Personio in Germany just raised a round with Axel, announced today, doing just that. Conto arguably is doing that. And I think that it's one of the other ways to build billion-dollar companies out of France or out of Europe, and it's very good because it just opens another way of building a big company rather than just going the US route and just shooting for the 50 states. So we're seeing that a lot. The way we look at it is going back to, and I think it encompasses all the discussion around failure, big amount of money lost, capacity to relaunch a business and so on is around the concept of it's a specific game to build $1 billion company, and I think it's kind of it's a specific way of building a company. It's like Formula One. You don't do Formula One with Twingo, or with a Gran Turismo car. You just need to have the proper vehicle to do your type of sport. If you do Formula One, you need a Formula One. You need a big team of 200 people just adjusting every single millimeter of equipment, and you need to have the proper just laps, number of laps, and then change each piece at each right moment. When you do Gran Turismo, you've got other problems. You need to have a co-pilot. You need to have all-round equipment. So, why am I saying that? It's because people are conflating all the types of entrepreneurship together, and I think it's not right, because when you launch a business, you need to be clear on what you want to achieve, what are you in there for, what are you after, what are you looking after, what do you want to build. And if you want to play a specific game, you need to access the funding and all the consequences of your choice, but you just need to not take assumptions from another type of company building if you're not happy to do that. And in the US, why people are comfortable with losing a lot of money? Because entrepreneurs are playing this game specifically, and investors are playing this game. So entrepreneurs, they are able to decide after 1 or 2 years spent in a company, say, okay, we have not reached the milestones we wanted to reach, so we are closing it down. Maybe we don't have any more money left. Maybe we are getting the money back to the investors. Investors are like, okay, fine, just give me the money back. The assumptions were not met. So here's some more money for your next company and try something else. As an investor, you could consider that you have maybe the opportunity to invest in 30 companies out of a fund. It's 30 times an amount of money you give to people that will commit 100% of their time to try to solve a problem. It's much more than what I will be able to spend on any single company, but they will be 100 or 200% committed to a specific topic. So if they can find a way, they will find a way. And it's certainly not you as an investor that will find the way instead of them. So it's a matter of beating the odds and finding the way. That's why everyone is comfortable with failing in the US.
Got it. Right. So we've talked a lot about kind of belief and ambition, and we talked about capital quite a lot. And I kind of said there's like 3 things that are important for a healthy tech ecosystem, and the third one is talent and people. So, Alice, what are you sort of talked a bit about the applications that you're seeing coming through to the family, and obviously through your portfolio, you get a lot of exposure to this. Like, what do you think are the big questions around talent here in France at the moment?
What we see here at the family regarding the talents is that yes, more and more of them are interested by starting their own companies, which is kind of new, because it used to be really a big thing to start your company 10 years ago. Now it's kind of, I want to be a CEO, so there is a hype around that. So it's no longer a barrier, a mental barrier to become an entrepreneur. But when it comes to attract, to attract talents from outside of France in the growing companies, maybe now that we have this equity plan that is more interesting, it will help. It's still not there yet. It's still not as easy to attract international talent. And what we, on a very, at my level, what we've seen is that there was an opportunity to create a company that would teach how to join startups. So we created here at the family Lion School, and it's 3,000 people who've been to Lion School, and basically it's people who have been to all the big schools, HEC, ESSEC, all the business schools, all the engineering schools, who have had a traditional career and who wants to switch and to get into the startup world. And you've seen all of this fundraise, so most of our startups were raising funds, but they were lacking these talents, this talent pool. So we decided to create this this school, and it's been growing very fast because the need was there. But it's not enough. It's not enough because it's only, it's newcomers. The teachers of these schools, they are the best founders of the family, which is great, but they are not the long-term experienced people from companies like Google, PayPal, Dropbox, or Airbnb. So it's still not the same. And these companies are acting like schools, because when you go to a company like that, you really learn, and it's not only technical, it's really like in terms of how does it work during a crisis, during this kind of in this kind of startups, and having the opportunity to work with these talents really change the game for your startup. So we still need to be open and to attract these talents, I think.
And Bruno, before the panel, we were kind of talking about this challenge of attracting experienced operators into companies. You've obviously seen a lot of companies scale. What have you seen that works for those companies in order to try and address this kind of talent gap that exists?
Well, I'm not sure I've seen many things that like recipes that work 100% of the time. I think that, well, it's difficult to just find enough talent that has been there, done that has been able to scale across different geographies to manage 100 and 200 and 500 then 1,000 people. You start seeing some of them, but it's a very small number of people, so if they are not available, so that's it. What's helping is that there has been, over the past few years, more and more talent coming back to Europe from the US. European-born talent that is coming back. It's just a trickle. It's not like big flows, but you're still seeing a bit of them that have been trained in big Silicon Valley companies, which comes with some challenges, around cultural fit, salary expectations, possibly, and so on. And that's something where having international investors on board helps a lot, because they bring a stamp of quality, which helps companies hire international talent. When you have raised with Sequoia, it sends signal to senior employees that they can join the company. It's well funded, well accompanied, and it has a strategic sense in the broader sense of where the company is going, and maybe it has a shot at being something big. And having those investors in terms of stamp, but also in terms of knowledge, of network, of capacity to find the right talent from the US that is available, or from the Nordics, from PayPal, from Dropbox in Ireland. That's something which helps a lot. So I would say that everything is connected between who are the investors you're picking, what's your strategy, and how you can build a thoughtful organization ahead of time. It's the feature, and everything. All this comes into one person, which is the CEO of the company. So what the CEO learns over time, over 1 to 5, 10 years, is just a good representation of where his company is going to go. So you just, as an investor, or as a friend, or as family, or as a broader part of the ecosystem, you need to help CEOs grow and learn, and nurture them with the biggest ambition and biggest culture you can.
Carol, what's have your observations been around this? Has it been a challenge for you?
Honestly, we don't hire yet outside of France. We did hire a country launcher for the Netherlands, so we did that. But the biggest challenge is definitely on the tech world, because I think 10 years from now we will be fully staffed to really empower tech and developers. I think right now we're a little late, because the schools, like it talked about Lion, which is a wonderful program. There are a few schools that have grown to really help developers, like, massive flow of students who will end up being developers. I think we were a little bit late in setting these up and really, pushing forward that agenda. But I think in 5 to 10 years that will be completely behind us, and we will be at the same level as they are in the US. That being said, I think that it's true. The ecosystem, especially in France, is very Parisian. So there are basically 100 startups who hire constantly, and you end up dating the same people. Like it's like high school all over again. Like when someone gets dumped, then just they picked up by someone else, and so it's a complicated issue because you really have to be creative to find ways to retain your talent and to make sure that they come to your place and not to the other guy's place. We've never hired outside, and we've thought about it at some point because it was really hard to hire developers. We have a technology that's it's very specific. It's Ruby on Rails. So there are a lot of talents in the US and in Canada, but not a lot in France yet. And talent is challenging. Hiring them is challenging. Retaining them is challenging. And we've at Joone we really focused on values, and we hire only people who really show interest in the value that we share, and not just the money and not just the potential. It does come with money and potential, obviously, but the very first is always a value fit. Like, how do they fit within the value set that we have? I think startups just have to be really creative in terms of what they have to offer to attract talent. There's a lot of things that's being done by President Macron. It's only helping, if anything. Is it sufficient? I don't know. And will this be sufficient to be a counterforce for the US? I think it depends more on the politics and things that are happening in the US than anything we can do here in France. Definitely.
You made an interesting point there about kind of it's concentrated here in Paris. And one of the kind of interesting trends that we've seen across Europe is sort of the spread of tech and entrepreneurial activity and company formation, I guess like beyond the capitals and into, more and more cities within countries. Are you seeing signs of that happening here in France? Like if you go to Lyon or to like Montpellier, wherever it might be, what's kind of the status of tech activity in those places?
I think the fact that people are a lot less scared about remote companies, remote center of activities. I think it really has helped in the past few years. So I think it's really actually growing positively. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the capital like VC and stuff still are centered in Paris. But there are so many really, really cool things happening in region. I mean, Nantes is growing so fast, and I think I know like 2 big startup companies who relocated to Nantes in like 6 months, which is a big thing. Like relocating a startup from Paris to Nantes means like 40% of the people working for you are not going to come with you. But I think that entrepreneurs are a lot more focused on how do you make the entire equation fit into something that's meaningful. And sometimes meaningful means let's just get out of Paris where it's crowded and annoying sometimes and go to a better place. So I think it's really positive, especially in France. I don't know if that's the case in the US, but in the US it's always the same. San Francisco, New York, San Francisco, and what happens in the middle is always a question mark.
I'm going to say some things that maybe will sound horrible, but just keep in mind I was born in Brittany and I grew up in Brittany, so I'm totally from the tip of Brittany, so no problem. I'm not from Paris, but I think and working under the assumption that you want to build a company that will someday reach 500, 1,000, 3,000 employees, I think it's almost doesn't make sense to just not build a company in Paris when you're in France, because it makes it even harder to just get access to a big enough pool of talent to reach those 500, 1,000 employees. It doesn't mean that you cannot have some part of the team that is remote, and I think that, as you were mentioning, being able to work in a distributed basis for a portion of the team is great because it's built into your processes, and then you can open an office in Barcelona or in Germany or in Eastern Europe, and you can work efficiently like that. But for many jobs, you cannot just put them elsewhere because, for instance, when you have salespeople, they need to be on the field. They need to be, when you're selling B2B, many of your clients, your customers will be probably headquartered in Paris because many decision centers are around Paris. So it's just making it even harder if you want to be dogmatic around building your company where you live in Montpellier or in Toulouse and so on. It's general topic. It's just not, of course, in specific skills areas. When you're in aeronautics, being in Toulouse makes sense. When you're fully distributed, you can be fully distributed. So but it's also a big cultural challenge to build a fully distributed company, and there are just maybe 3-4 of them operating at scale currently. So it comes with its own challenges. So long story short, I think, why am I saying that? It's because I think in terms of ecosystem is around liquidity for money, entrepreneurs, talent. And if you don't have the liquidity, it's just harder to build the company, and then a US company will pop up and maybe be faster than you.
I agree and disagree, because at the end, you know, like 10 years ago, just to give you an image, when I used to run the first acceleration program in France, it was a co-working space, an open space, where all the 12 startups, they were all together all day. And it ended up being a nightmare, because every time one guy was opening a beer, everybody wanted to open a beer, you know? It's really like a kind of animal behavior. We want to follow the crew. Today, Paris is really like 3 hours away from any other cities, and I would really recommend our startup, you know, to focus most of their time and execute, you know, and build their own culture with their team. And of course, once in a while, every 2 weeks, every month, it depends on your business, going in the city and making the most out of it and exchanging and making business. And for this, it's good to have a country that is centralized, because it's all in one place. And it's the same for London. It's not the same for Germany, which kind of is becoming a problem. So I see the advantage of having a centralized country, because you can get there and maximize your time there. When it's not on strike. It's 3 hours away. But actually, I met BlaBlaCar 2 days ago, and he was telling me that in December he doubled his amount of customers on BlaBlaCar because of the strike. So it can even be good, the strike, for startups.
And honestly, you get so much more funding from BP when you're outside of Paris. Like, if you have the chance to get outside of Paris, even just for the BP money, just do it. Honestly, there's no chance in hell you get any money from BP when you're in France, when you're in Paris. So just get it outside of Paris if you want that money.
There we go. Right, well, I'm conscious that we should open to the floor, and you really want to say something, don't you?
Yeah,
okay,
because she's promoting to take money from the state. And I would say, no, but today actually the reality is that if you are a startup, you cannot not take the money from BP, because everybody is taking the money from BP. So if you're not taking it, you're disadvantaged. That became, you know, like the norm. So I can no longer say don't take the money
from BP. You know that? I mean, you know that obviously, but I've never taken any money from the
True.
BP. And yeah, it's just and I'm a girl, so it says a lot. Like, if you're a girl and you don't get money from BP, that says a lot. But yeah, no, that was just a joke.
Sorry to just go off rail. One point on this topic of BPI money, we do have raised with BPI, so just conscious of that too. I think the way I think about it is, it's money that is available for entrepreneurs to build things, so it's up to you what you build with that. You can just take the bias out of it and double down on the bias and build funds that are too big, and you just earn money through fees and so on. And I think that's what Alice is referring to, talking about many VCs. Or you can just build a business of raising subsidies from BPI and just while it away in salaries and offsites and and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you can use the same money to build something meaningful. And in many ways, having fundraised with many institutions in Europe the past year, BPI and its equivalent in Europe, which is the EIF, are playing a role of kickstarting businesses and funds, which should be played by pension funds or family offices or private institutions that simply do not exist in Europe. So they are replacing other institutions that have been existing in the US for decades, maybe also because family offices are richer in the US, you've had entrepreneurial success. So once you will have entrepreneurial successes with founders that raise money, exit companies, become billionaires, then they will replace public money with their family offices, I hope. But so that's the only, but I agree with obviously your overall philosophy around public money, which is sometimes too much.
Your life on me.